All right, well, top of the hour. So we'll roll
Here we
off
go.
here with a part 3 intro for Dan Winter. Welcome, everyone. Today, the excitement is palpable as we gear up for another dynamic dialogue with Dan Winter, who syncretized innovative concepts like the physics of negentropy, phase conjugation, and the golden ratio's role in life itself never fail to inspire. Having already joined us twice before on X, Dan's third appearance brings us into focus on practical application and a chance to reconnect with this ever-growing community of open-minded thinkers and innovators. Dan's FireRay device, found at fireray.com, represents cutting-edge evolution and plasma implosion technology, harnessing phase conjugate magnetics and low-frequency harmonics to create a powerful, blissful healing experience. This next-generation tool embodies Winter's Planck fire equations, amplifying negentropy to enhance life force energy and cellular coherence programming with remarkable precision and accessibility. Whether you're a longtime follower or new to his work, get ready for a knowledge-packed session that's sure to ignite both your mind and your imagination and leave you buzzing with some new dots connected and new perspectives to contemplate. Buckle up for an electrifying exchange that's as thought-provoking as it is transformative. Welcome, Dan Winter.
Thank you. You make me sound important. I'm grateful.
You are important, sir. I think you are an important piece to humanity. All the things that you have just embodied in yourself, and I think you'd agree too. I mean, there's people in here that aren't necessarily putting all their work and experiences online, but they're changing the frequency of the earth, and I think you're doing both while also connecting the dots for people in physics, metaphysics, and I love that you've always connected it to, for such a long time, see the connection, not just some out there math, but it's also physiological realities within us that are all interconnected. So thank you for all that you've done and do.
Great. So today's talk is primarily about negentropic healing plasma, regenerative electric fields, regenerative plasma fields, and even sometimes called medbed related. And obviously, this has to do with the way in which phase conjugation famously has produced time reversal and is related to the concept of how a stem cell de-differentiates, literally goes back to the past and goes back to its more generalized self. The time reversal has a very specialized meaning there. But I want to start with something very simple and very, well, I would hope elegant, actually. So our subject today is essentially what electric fields make life and what electric field makes life self-organized or negentropic. And see if we can understand that in very practical ways that we've applied. As you can see, now we're at about I think it's about our 7th major invention, the imploder, Therify, Plasma Fire, PiezoFire.com. We have a lot of these inventions, and they're all amazingly successful, if I may say so humbly. And so we are very much in the practice of applying negentropy and creating life force to technologies. And how to do that practically is the subject of today's conversation. And how to visualize that, the little story I want to start with. And this story may even get to Aaron's question, which was, what about those new scans under the Great Pyramid? What's that? So this little story for today starts with when the famous book Seeds of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty came out. There's extensive pictures and documentation in that book, which correlates something many had long known, which is basically, those ancient stone circles and stone structures, even pyramids, their primary purpose wasn't, to be an altar or to be a place to live in or a place to do ritual. The primary, original, fundamental purpose of most of those sacred sites was actually to cause seeds to germinate. This was a device to pre-treat seeds to cause them to germinate and motorize agriculture. That's the evidence presented in that book, Seeds of Knowledge. So then there's hundreds of pictures, and we can dig those out. There's lots of ways to see those pictures. But basically, you put seeds germinating inside any of these sacred pyramid structures, and most of them they did at Stonehenge, of course. You get a dramatic effect on seed growth, dramatic. And of course, there was absolutely zero information in that book about how and why. No one seemed to know. And I thought that was that was the tragedy of ignorance that I was very much determined to dig into that little hole of why it is that sacred sites and pyramids cause seeds to grow. Now, because in difficult times, survival dependent, you need to zap your seeds ahead of time, and suddenly you got success. And by the way, since that time, many of our people using Therify and now Firay.com, they will use our plasma devices to zap their seeds. Actually, there's a group in Germany called Plucker, P-L-O-C-H-E-R, Plucker.de. Now they've evolved some, but essentially they took a what was equivalent of a pyramid, although for them it's secret, but it was basically a capacitor, implosive capacitance, which is what a pyramid is. And that's what the Ark of the Covenant is, also is an implosive capacitor. So you put an implosive capacitor like a pyramid or the Ark of the Covenant in this above the ceiling, and then you put these white plastic buckets full of this highly piezoelectric quartz sand or calcite sand, highly piezo, and you zap the sand, zap the quartz sand, and then you take that sand, which is now ringing, and you hold that sand in your hand, you can feel it ring, literally, it rings like a bell, which is now actually our firecrystal.com, P-H-I-R-E crystal.com. And the point is, what caused that fire crystal to ring, what caused that quartz sand to ring, and what caused those seeds to grow is one very, very simple thing. An electrically implosive wave called a phase conjugate pump wave. It looks like a pine cone caduceus, and it's a squirt gun that squirts out coherent longitudinal out the nozzle of that wave, which is the Planck threshold, where the transverse EMF is converted to coherent longitudinal compressional EMF. And the point of this lecture basically is, in summary, that it's the compressional component of that wave called longitudinal EMF, incorrectly called scalar or torsional. And it's only the compressional component of the electromagnetic wave which is able to do a good squeeze. and it's the centripetal potential of that symmetrically arriving squeeze wave, longitudinal compressional waves. And if those compressional waves symmetrically arriving from opposite sides arrive in the correct implosive symmetry called a phase conjugate pump wave, the ideal, perfect phase conjugate pump wave being, and lots of credit to Thoth Hermes in my view here, the Schumann resonance harmonic cascade of this planet. It is within a fraction of a percentage of the equation. Take Planck, multiply by golden ratio, keep going, and you get the Schumann harmonics, perfect phase conjugate pump wave. And that's the subject of the entire book, Planckfire.com, P-L-A-N-C-K-P-H-I-R-E, Planckfire.com. My book, which says that fractal implosive charge collapse tuned to Planck is the cause of negentropy in the cause of gravity, the cause of life force, the cause of consciousness, and also the cause of all action at a distance, because that's what they call entanglement. It's actually phase conjugation perfected, which is called embedding perfected, which is called fractality perfected. Anyway, so you take that caduceus-shaped wave, the Schumann cascade, and you pump it. And because it's tuned correctly to cascade and implode, it's just like cracking the whip, actually. And where the whip cracks, out comes the end, is this compressional longitudinal. Example, you got this dark basement with no light. You put a sheet of copper on the roof and a wire down to the basement, another sheet of copper. When the sun hits the copper plate on the roof, the seeds in that basement, plants in the basement, are going to grow beautifully in the pitch dark, because that sheet of copper on the roof with a wire connecting to the sheet of copper in the basement conveys the longitudinal EMF component of the sun, which makes things grow. So basically, let's understand this on a much simpler, basic level. The difference between a seed which is alive and a seed which is dead is, it really sucks. I mean, it sucks, doesn't it? I mean, it implodes. So the idea is that when you put a seed in its nutrient, life or death is its ability to attract its first nutrient. And that really sucks. And that implosion is due to charge collapse. the cause of life, all negentropy, consciousness, and gravity. So charge collapse, perfect tuned fractal charge collapse, is the motor, which makes a seed germinate, which makes a pyramid generate global wireless power, which makes vacuum energy in firecrystal.com work, which makes all action at a distance. It is that implosive charge collapse where you gain energy during charge collapse. Oh, that's the name of our keynote today, gain energy. So the only way you can gain energy during charge collapse is when you tune the harmonics of that charge collapse to Planck, so that when the charge reaches that Planck threshold, precisely tuned, it will non-destructively convert the transverse EMF to longitudinal at that point, answering the question that stumped Einstein's life, which was he knew infinite non-destructive charge collapse was a reason gravity exists, but he didn't know what caused infinite non-destructive charge collapse. Now we know. When the charge is imploding and it reaches the Planck threshold, it propagates efficiently into the coherent EMF longitudinal array, sometimes called gravity waves and sometimes called the collective unconscious and sometimes called the etheric net. So it's sometimes called Indra's web. And you got to have a node in that array if you want telepathy or labyrinths or cathedrals or plasma devices to work good, because that's where the implosion and the charge collapse is enabled. So that's a little conversation about if you get the charge collapse working, you gain energy imploding charge toward that center. And when that happens, you see, remember that golden ratio cascade, tuned to Planck fractality perfected, is also phase conjugation perfected. You then gain energy because the charge has a place to exit, which is in golden ratio multiples times the speed of light, which is how the gravity array propagates. Remember when Professor Raymond Chow, famously after thousands of measurements of faster than light velocities, his measures all centered between 1.5 and 1.7 times c, the speed of light. So centered almost exactly around 1.618 golden ratio times c, the speed of light, which would be or is the smoking gun that I am correct, that the reason that array works is because you can propagate faster than light efficiently only using golden ratio, because that is the perfection of non-destructive charge distribution, which also happens to be the definition of the religious term heaven for that reason. So perfecting charge distribution is another name for life and consciousness itself in this sense, and to embed in that array. And so that's how gravity waves propagate. And that's how, as we said in the first lecture, only love bends the light, therefore only love creates. So now moving this conversation back to the practicalities of building plasma devices. So remember, you got these two pine cone-shaped caduceus waves squirting at you from opposite directions. And where the pine cones kiss noses, they implode. And when they gain energy during collapse by imploding where the pine cones kiss noses, called phase conjugation, what happens is only the waves that can embed in the phase discipline, it's sort of like face discipline, like kissing, except phase discipline. The only waves that can embed in that phase discipline survive. The practical example is if you want to die well, which is a compression event, absolutely, you have to enter a non-destructive compression of black hole and propagate into the array. That's called successful death. And to do that, you cannot take any wave with you, which is not compressible. Example, anger. It ain't going to go because it doesn't squeeze well. We know the physics, the syntax literature, that anger is a wave ratio of 1/7, and the touch has been measured a million times. And that is absolutely uncompressible. So that is why anger absolutely will not survive death, because it is a electrical geometry that cannot propagate. So that's why you see your whole life in the minute before you die for that reason, because it's like a good fight in an Irish pub. After the compression event, everyone claps their hands and they say, well, that's sorted now. And so the sorting that happens at the center of implosion has the function of allowing only perfect phase discipline to survive, meaning The second order power spectrum of the EKG, which reveals perfect charge distribution coherence, is a very functional lie detector, as I have proven for that reason, as it is also functional to measure kinesiology. So you literally, you get shareable or you don't die well. So anywho, hopefully this gives us some intuition about how and why implosion is negentropic. Let's take another very classic example. Lovelock went to a lot of trouble to prove with dozens of physiologic, biologic variables, temperature, pressure, atmosphere, that Gaia, Earth, is negentropic. That's the point of the Gaia hypothesis. He didn't have one clue, not one clue, what made Gaia negentropic. I was the first to answer that question, that the cascade of the Schumann harmonics is implosive. So the reason the planet Earth is negentropic is because it's the phase conjugate pump wave of the Schumann cascade. I feel very strongly that's the reason Earth is negentropic. So if we would like to emerge from chaos, hint, we might need to retune our cities to plankfire.com, which is also the Schumann cascade. Where in your city is the Schumann still alive? I ask you that question. It's a messy question. So anywho, now we begin to get a sense of why phase conjugate charge implosion can self-organize. And we're going to apply this to the thought of regenerative healing in a moment. But before we do that, I want to mention one more thing. As any physicist, and I do mean physicists thinking about this, would obviously want to think about is, okay, what happened the first time they measured phase conjugation among lasers in optics and measured negentropy? Okay, what happened is you got these two lasers that are aligned with an angstrom level accuracy at 180 degrees, imploding from opposite directions, precisely in phase. And what they didn't know then is if they had tuned those lasers to plankfire.com, it would have worked better, but they didn't know that at the time. but anyway, so you got these two lasers coming from opposing directions. And now those lasers have to meet and kiss noses like pine cones in a very specific kind of way in order to make what has been named time reversal in optical physics. They called it time reversal. What they really meant was negentropy. Okay, in other words, what laser physics and phase conjugate optics did prove is you could time reverse rusted steel back to being unrusted. You could increase the order, but you could not time reverse unrusted steel to make it rusted, which is to say you cannot time reverse toward disorder. No, according to studies of physics, as I understand it, is in physics, the measurements they show you can only time reverse toward order. The name for that is called negentropy, which is self-organization. And the reason you can only time reverse and go toward order and not away from order is exactly what we just explained, that in the presence of that implosion. So there is a self-sorting. In the presence of that implosion, there is a self-sorting. So now, for the first time, what physics did not know is why they required a super dielectric to make a phase conjugate optical phase conjugation. Which is often, not always, but often barium strontium titanate, which is the famous paper Alice in Barium Titanate Land, which says that phase conjugate fields are self-organizing and they know how to find themselves at a distance. Oh my God, they self-recognize. Oh my God, phase conjugate fields are like Alice in Barium Titanate Land, which is the name of the famous paper on the subject. The reason that these fields find themselves at a distance and appear to self-organize and to, quote, know themselves. Does this mean self-aware? Ooh, scratching head now. So anyway, the point is the same super dielectric, which is why the insect skeletons float in the cavity structure effect of Podklednov's gravity making insect skeletons, and the same super dielectric, which was the coating on Nostradamus's mirror scrying cup, and the same phase conjugate dielectric, which was the Olmec black obsidian mirror used for ancestor phone calls. These phase conjugate materials enable cohering the longitudinal array, which is the physics of clairvoyance and clairaudience, and therefore is the physics of the array of ancestor memory. As we know now, when we teach kids to phase conjugate their brainwaves, not only do they begin seeing without their eyes, but they start seeing their ancestors. The dead ancestors show, dead grandma and grandpa suddenly show up, and the parents are shocked. The kids, yeah. Anywho, so the point is that the superdielectric is a name, barium, strontium, titanate is only an example, but it's a name for a media within which charge distribution is perfected, which is to say, pine cones are enabled to permissively touch noses, okay? And so if you have these superdielectrics, for example, this is the physics why if you walk into a steel or aluminum house, you feel like Merd. You walk into a house of all biologic material and your aura goes, ah. The difference is the dielectric constant, which is enabled charge distribution, which is how your aura propagates, which is why that perfected charge distribution is the only definition of all religions' words for heaven. Plains of Sharon, Champs-Élysées, these are all names for permissive charge distribution. So the negentropy of the phase conjugate moment. So I want to open up this up to questions in just a moment, but try to just finish the thought, this part of the thought here, which is, well, how does phiray.com work? That's PHIRAY.com. So we have a whole legacy of these devices. Now, our piezofire.com, P-I-E-Z-O, piezofire, P-H-I-R-E, piezofire.com is very expensive, like $700, and people are getting pain reduction, circulation restoration, regeneration. It's very inexpensive piezoelectric phase conjugate implosive. Now, if you make that phase conjugation more broad spectral, then you have devices like our Therify and now Phi-Ray. Phi-Ray portends to be 2 to 4 times at least more powerful than the Therify, which was famous in 40 countries around the world. So we replaced that with Phiray.com because it is 2 to 4 times more powerful and 1/4 of the cost, and adds that super implosive phase conjugate magnetic coil, completely new addition, which is in phase with the phase conjugate optical plasmas. Now, there's just a few key concepts that should be explained, and this was in the slideshow there that, again, phiray.com/gain energy collapse. So the concept that should be conveyed here, we started on slide number 6 about the chronovisor, and you see that purple plasma, the carbon arc, which also was the chronovisor of the time reversal devices. And by the way, you do get time dilation effects with our plasma devices at higher amplitudes for sure. And we know why. The time dilation is simply experience of spin rate, which is the definition of the experience of time. So the classic example here is Tesla's life work began when he began to see the magic of the carbon arc. And that is the slide number 8 following. So it has the classic picture of Buckminster fullerene, dodecaecosa, our star mother kit, goldenmean.info/kit, infinite dodecaecosa stellation, which is what carbon does in the presence of an arc. And it was named fullerene, even though Bucky didn't have a clue, and I was with him when he was studying this. He did know that the Ecosa collapse was important, but he studied this in terms of material science and did not have the first electrical engineering insight. Although I'm not dishonoring Bucky, I'm just saying he didn't really understand the electrical aspect. But calling it fullerene was noble, and the fullerene is simply a dodecaecosa geometry of carbon atoms which pops out to the Ecosa array, specifically in the presence of an implosive arc, as in the Ark of the Covenant, sometimes called the mercy seat, because it's an implosive conjugate arc. The point is, in the center of carbon in the array, which is the fullerene, which is what carbon can do in the presence of Tesla's arc, what happens is at the center of that dodecaecosa, you get a phase conjugate implosive negentropic field in the middle, which is magic. For example, when Pat Flanagan made microhydrin, he tucked a clathrate dodecaecosa of water molecules, the same geometry, and he tucked an implosive fractal hydrogen atom in the middle, nanohydrogen, which my equation showed is the same dodecaecosa. So the carbon arc makes the magical implosive capacitive arc, which then is included the function of the Ark of the Covenant, the original primary function, which was to reduce radioactive fields. And implosive capacitance is the opposite of radioactivity for obvious reasons, for anyone who's even thought about it, including why nuclear critical mass is measurably reduced at the dodecaecosa Earth grid sacred site nodes, as Bruce Cathy famously measured. That's implosive arc, the Ark of the Covenant. And I was there in Cachet's living room when TEPCO called him from Japan and said, oh yeah, these nanomaterials, they do reduce radioactivity. So the reason is this implosive capacitance. The central problem of all this conversation today is really quite simple. Physics doesn't seem to know why anything is centripetal. Oops, do you think that could be a problem? So obviously they will never, ever learn why an object falls to the ground, or why life exists, or why consciousness exists, or self-organization exists, or phase conjugation, or negentropy exists. They can have no potential to ever learn why any of those things exist until they first learn why anything is centripetal. And anything that is centripetal is so always and specifically only because it does charge collapse fractally tuned to Planck, which is the next slide, number 9. The gain energy during charge collapse is the electric reason gravity exists and objects fall to the ground, the reason perception exists, the reason seeds germinate, the reason soul exists, the reason pyramids make wireless power, the reason zero-point energy vacuums. So that's slide number 9. The reason golden ratio is the dominant geometry of orbital mechanics, because it's the only way to stabilize gravity in atmosphere, because gravity exists because of that specific fractal charge collapse only. So you want to stabilize gravity in atmosphere, hello, that's why the pyramids were called planet taming, because, and they were called the Hummer, because they would implode that phase conjugate pump wave. And so then the last slides I'll just refer to are slides number 12 and 13, more pictures of the carbon arc. And finally, slides 14 and 15 here, you see on slide number 14, the transverse EMF wave goes in the vortex on one side, and because it goes down that vortex perfectly, called optimized translation of vorticity, out the squirt gun nozzle, called Planck, comes the perpendicular inertia of the aligned coherent longitudinal EMF, which is directional. So the squirt gun squirts out a longitudinal EMF directionally if the vortex is correct geometry, which, for example, the radii of hydrogen is a good example. So that is how all electrogravitics work. You grab a hold of the transverse wave and squeeze it out and implode it into directional longitudinal EMF, which, as Bearden's equations proved, is the definition of a gravity wave. So last slide to be discussed here is just number 15, where you see, look, and it's even animated in the original. I don't know if it's animated on the screen, but if you see the longitudinal compressional waves arriving symmetrically from opposing perfectly symmetrical directions, which indigenous people would call the sacred four directions, which phase conjugate optics calls four-wave mixing, is that when the directional symmetry, which is literally cubic, of the arriving centripetal waves, which is why you get two opposing phase conjugate tubes in phi-ray.com, when the centripetal force arrives symmetrically from opposing directions, it makes what they hit in the center also electrically centripetal, defining the origin of all centripetal forces, and therefore the origin of negentropy, because when something gets centripetal, it has to get negentropic, because what's squeezed out the center is every wave that doesn't fit the array, making it more self-organizing, defining healing, defining the negentropy well known in phase conjugate optics, which we are now producing in plasma. So I talked really fast. I got enthused, but that was the intro I had in mind. Shall we open this up to conversation, or what do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, no, that sounds beautiful. What a great introductory presentation to the Phi-Ray device. And also just to remind people on Practical, the first link up in the nest, so if you swipe all the way to the right, I think there's only 2 right now, that'll send you to the slideshow that Dan's referring to. It's a keynote software presentation. So if you mouse over, click on the far left margin, it'll pull up an index of all the numbers of slides, and then you can follow along from there. So yeah, it's fantastic.
Yes.
J.K. Philippian has a question. Love for him to be able to ask.
Yeah, thanks for your introduction. I appreciate that. You had mentioned the pyramids and what's going on in the news with the supposed 3D dimensions and models. So I was thinking, in what you had just said, now these could be, now there's 8 spiraled cylinders with 2 cubic boxes in the bottom. So what I'm thinking is, if they're Helmholtz cavity acoustic resonators, and you also talk about, or maybe that can phase conjugate, heterodyne, and implosive charge. You talk about they being a Hummer. You also say that they could be a gravity diode. So I'm curious how that can, what that can be in your theory.
Yeah, exactly. You're on precisely the right track there. Remember that we have measured many pyramids, especially we did a lot of measurements in Sam's pyramid in Bosnia, Sam Osmanagic, and we have films on that. You'll see it on our YouTube channel. Dan Winter Fractal Field is the name of the YouTube channel. 4 million views. What we got by measuring was the low frequencies in that pyramid. Not only did we get the Schumann cascade, but my equation shows the Schumann perfected would be 7.29 hertz, but the actual Schumann is 7.83. So if you take the Schumann cascade from 7.29 hertz, you get slightly off. But if you take the 7.83 Schumann harmonic and do the golden ratio cascade, then you get bang on the frequencies we measured in all these pyramids, which instead of 50 then becomes 53 hertz. And on the roof, it's 28, the famous 28 kilohertz. So at least about 8 harmonics well measured in these structures, these pyramids, perfectly fit PlantFire.com, slightly modified to Schumann. So remember, that is the reason PhiRay.com is so much exquisitely more powerful. We took that exact cascade, perfected Schumann harmonic cascade with more harmonics in it, amplified the heck out of it, so much heavier magnetic flux density. And that coil in PhiRay.com, everybody gets this incredible compression, bliss, cocoon, grounding experience. It's super cool. And what we did is we took exactly what pyramids are doing, amplified the heck out of it, and made a high flux density Schumann cascade. And that is the heart of PhiRay.com. Actually, for the first time, we got implosive Schumann magnetics precisely tuned inside, in phase with the plasma implosion. So back to your question. So I would say we have a smoking gun on the day when they measure, as I have done and measured many pyramids, when they measure the harmonics in those waveguide cavities down below, and when they measure those harmonics are in fact PlantFire.com, then they will confirm that I am right, that what the pyramid is doing, why it's called the gravity diode, is by imploding the amplified resonant Schumann harmonic cascade called a phase conjugate pump wave, which is how you make gravity, for example, and how you pump out coherent longitudinal EMF, sometimes called pyramidwirelesspower.com. And so this is all written up at pyramidwirelesspower.com. So, I haven't studied this new. I know that the people who are expert in ground penetrating radar are very skeptical of these new measurements of what's under the pyramids. And so, this is right now, this new pyramid scan is mostly exciting the woo-woos. It hasn't really excited the experts, but because the data is really not in, it's still exciting because it gets us to think about a principle. So you're absolutely right. I would totally hypothesize, but have not proven, that those cavities down below, when we measure the frequencies they're resonating at, the spiral down the column and the Helmholtz resonator cavities down below, what they're doing is amplifying the implosive harmonic cascade, both piezoelectrically and paramagnetically, to implode more efficiently the Schumann phase conjugate pump wave, to squeeze out at the center accurately and directionally the coherent longitudinal EMF, which defines how you make global wireless power. Remember, Tesla had the frequencies wrong and he had the nodes wrong. He really didn't get it. He didn't know how to make longitudinal coherently, even though he referred to the energy at a distance, because he didn't know PlantFire.com, didn't know how to tune, didn't know how to find this longitudinal nodes, and didn't know the right harmonics. He chose 60 and 50 instead of 50, which was a catastrophe.
Right.
So anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So what they're saying is that they're recording the data using phonon data, and they use differential interferometry, synthetic aperture radar. So it's interesting that they're using interferometry in order to find out that, in fact, the device is interferometry based.
Yes. Yeah, but now they need to extend their thinking to understand what coherent longitudinal EMF interferometry. Remember, 99% of electrical engineers don't have a clue what longitudinal EMF is, not to mention how to pick it up and receive it. Certainly no one in physics does, which explains, for example, the stupidity of those people at the Princeton Noosphere project who they call it a Josephson junction. It's a capacitor that picks up a longitudinal, and they're measuring when thousands of millions of people have the same emotion at the same time. The reason is because it's a longitudinal measuring device. So physics hasn't figured out how to do longitudinal yet, except those who are a threat to national security.
And one final question: are you familiar with Michael Boyd, where he has a patent that actually I guess he does reference that it's gravity diodes, where it's nano pits in a hard drive spherical device, and it spins, and he's able to measure these gravity cancellations. So I don't know if you've seen that, or if not, we can reconvene, or I could post that later on. So it's basically these nano pits spinning that create this negative gravity effect. So I don't know if you're familiar with him or not. Michael Boyd.
Yes, I'm looking at the web pages now. Thank you. Well, I would just hypothesize that this is a direct analog to when they finally came up with a hypothesis of why Podkleddnov's insect skeletons made gravity. The word they used for it was the cavity structure effect. And what they meant was that not only was the insect skeleton, which after 1 billion years evolved to be a super dielectric, but then the cavities within that super dielectric, they looked like valentines. Oh, let's think about charge implosion. So let me guess, now we could optimize the cavities that Michael Boyd is using. Now that we know the reason what kind of cavity would make gravity is what would optimize capacitive charge implosion, which relates to the 60-degree cone of the nested dodeca, which relates to the valentine structure, etc. So implosive capacitance has a simple geometry. And another tragedy there is why Wilhelm Reich called that orgone, since he didn't know what a capacitor was.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers.
I have a quick follow-up on that, perhaps, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, so I just wanted to say regarding the paper, this is Nathan, by the way. I'm here on a dummy account recording. We've talked before. I asked about neutrinos. Thank you for taking my questions. I just wanted to say, to your point about longitudinal interferometry, I believe that may be exactly what this paper has discovered, and exactly why scientists in the mainstream are skeptical of it, because of this new modeling technique, which would involve this kind of component. In the paper, they specifically bring up 0-point energy quantum effects.
Yeah.
And I think that could be the actual great answer of how they've got these results. It was very interesting. But I wanted to bring up this topic of Helmholtz. In the conversation of Helmholtz vortexes and the definition of it as a metric of energy available or free energy available in a system, I wanted to relate this to this scalar kind of a potential and free energy and negentropy. I also think it might relate to enthalpy as a concept of, total amount of work available. But in physics, it's normally taken as something that you just, like a clock that you run down, not something that you could build up. And so I wonder if enthalpy and negentropy and, the Helmholtz cavity. I'm sorry, I'm kind of painting a wide picture because I'm trying to synthesize from science that, isn't widely available. But I wanted to talk about the cavity in these Helmholtz cavities and the Lockheed Martin coherent matter wave beam patent, which also uses cavities and seems to be cohering matter. And it looks as if that's what we're talking about when we're talking about putting these waves together as some kind of a coherence. So I apologize for the long-winded question. If you're capable of looking something up, I would ask if you could look at the Lockheed Martin patent for coherent matter wave beam generations.
Well, thank you. And you bring up such fun stuff. I wanted to go back to Michael Boyd. I just see that the language they use with Michael Boyd, they call it resolving the extra dimensions for gravity. Now, I think that's worth meditating on for a moment, because what they call the next dimension is obviously only electrically the ability to superpose the next non-destructive superposed axis of charge rotation. The only definition of going to the next dimension, obviously. And obviously, if you got a tetracubic symmetry, you cannot superpose any other axis of superposed rotation other than dodecahedron around the tetracube, which requires the addition of golden ratio. So the golden ratio is the only way to add the next superposed axis of spin symmetry to anything that's tetracubic, for sure. That's obvious. So what's called the next dimension is obviously the vortex made when you add a golden ratio and when you do that, obviously, you make these 60-degree vortex cones, which is what the extra dimension they call for gravity, is simply the name for how to make a charged vortex make gravity. My film by that title has 40,000 views. I recommend it. How a charged vortex makes gravity. So obviously, just when the vortex has the right angle to implode the transverse EMF into coherent longitudinal directional through the Planck threshold by tuning to PlanckFire.com, that's how the charged vortex makes gravity. So these things fit together nicely. And then I see in Helmholtz, it says, in fluid mechanics, Helmholtz theory is named after him. Describes a three-dimensional motion of fluid in the vicinity of vortex lines. So obviously what they're trying to get to, and again, I'm saying this superficially, not having studied this well enough, but is what is the perfect vortex, in this case, for gravity making? And I think, I'm being humble here, but I think I'm the first scientist on this planet to ever entertain the question, what is the perfect vortex for making gravity? Hint, 60-degree implosion cone dodecahedron stellation, tuned to PlanckFire.com. And that would bring us to the third comment about matter waves, which would be, and again, having not studied that, this is a superficial reply, but still I think it's fun. If you look at the very famous EM drive, which is a trapezoidal cone-shaped cavity within which you bounce microwave, obviously into a caduceus, and you make gravity. Oh, and obviously if they had the skill to tune that to PlanckFire.com, they would make more gravity. Hello. So yes, I think in fluid mechanics, a three-dimensional motion of fluid in the vicinity of vortex line of charge could be optimized for gravity making after you knew which vortex makes gravity best, which is which vortex converts transverse to longitudinal best, which spinning out that longitudinal directionally in one direction defines how you make a gravity wave, because it defines how you get a hold of the ambient field. You can't get a hold of the ambient field if you're a transverse wave. No, you can't grab. But if you're a longitudinal compressional wave, then you can get into phase with the ambient field and pump out the directional compressional. And the directional compression, obviously successful compression, implosive compression, defines gravity. And therefore, that's how you get a handle on the field. So if you can make a longitudinal wave, you can make gravity. And I would say that's probably what's behind Helmholtz trying to describe the three-dimensional motion of fluid in the vicinity of vortex lines. If that fluid is in fact charged, for example, which we believe is a perfect superfluid. So again, my answers may be somewhat superficial, but what they're calling coherence there, again, I believe I have defined the perfected form of coherence, which is implosion to Planck. In fact, I'm known in the medical literature for being the first one to define heart coherence. It was the second order power spectrum, the EKG. And what we defined that as massive coherence, we now know the climax form of coherence is in fact charge collapse.
So I have a question on that, actually. So coherence, I know we talked about before, HeartMath Institute, and you're working with them and being able to define out, like I said, the actual wave formations of heart coherence, then also heart-brain coherence. But then also, what about heart-brain-gut coherence, like the actual harmonic interaction of the three primary dantians or energy centers?
Well, actually measuring gut coherence has not been directly my field, but it's obviously very relevant. But what I can say is we know the low frequencies of the breath define the ability to couple the HRV to the spinal liquid pump to the heart, to the brain. So clearly the low frequencies of the breath here would be very relevant. And obviously the low frequency of the breath, which is classically the Mayer wave breath, the 10-second breath, which is the only definition of heart coherence for the Heart Math Institute, actually a 10-second breath, 5-second, which is a beautiful way to start. But anyway, these low-frequency breaths, which implode the perfect phase conjugate pump wave, measurable in the spine liquid pump, the only mechanic of Kundalini and bliss, as Bentoff proved with me in his lab, and the biomechanics of Kundalini, goldenmean.info/Kundalini for the documentaries. So yes, that does definitely phase lock the Dantian, the solar plexus, if you believe. Well, anyway, what we can say, what we measured was low frequencies of the spine liquid pump, low frequencies of the breath, low frequencies of the EKG, which is HRV, and the low frequencies of the EEG. All of that by measurement is for sure completely included and described and measured with graphs at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. Doesn't take long to extrapolate that to what's happening at the solar plexus for sure. And in fact, our software, which offers harmonics for the chakras, including the guts, at flameandmind.com, the Flame and Sound software, and you can plug that into FireRay and Plasma Fire, and you can ring whichever chakra you want, and it does work. And in the literature at flameandmind.com, where Patrick Botti with the Flame and Sound software, which is part of that. Remember, the audio only Perfect Bliss binaural software there is very cheap. You don't need the brainwave stuff necessarily. And in that literature there, you find Patrick's references to the frequencies of the chakras in the sacrocranial literature.
And also to bring like a physiological definition to that. So my understanding over time, the chakras, we understand them in purely the energetic spectrum. They're actually directly correlated to nervous system ganglion in our body. They will resonate different frequencies, react with different glands. And so then there being an equation, understanding the cranial and sacral pumps, the actual cranial wave, being able to measure the heart brain frequencies. So aligning your chakras or energizing them, it seems to me you're really clearing out physiological circuitry, basically, so it can operate in harmony without short circuits or other issues, right?
Yes, actually, slide number 32 today on the bottom, you see those. You see the Planck fire frequencies, you see the breath frequencies, you see the HRV frequencies, and you see the brainwave frequencies, and you see the Schumann frequencies, all in the same identical cascade for that reason. So that's some of that literature is right there in today's slideshow. Yes, the phase lock of the heart, brain, gut system on all those low frequencies for the chakras is directly related to the fact that when the body implodes, you get negentropy and bliss, and that needs to be massive and in phase with Schumann to couple the planet.
If I may, here real quick, basically life is hydrogen conjugation and broad spectrum as well.
Yeah, well, I was the first to prove how hydrogen is fractal for sure. So 3 exact radii of hydrogen are precisely golden ratio exponents times Planck, which is a smoking gun. Not only that hydrogen is fractal, but that's the smoking gun of how and why hydrogen makes gravity. And obviously it's a perfect phase conjugator, as I was the first one to prove. And that's why nanohydrogen, microhydrogen works so well, just like nanocarbon does, because they're perfect phase conjugators.
And perfect phase conjugation is basically high frequency vacuum polarization.
That would be a name for it. Actually, it's the perfect way to create a vacuum because it's the perfect way to create suction through the 0 point, which is the perfect way to create negentropy self-organization, which is the origin of all centripetal forces.
And plasma is self-organizing.
The noble gases there are called noble very specifically because just exactly like that carbon and like that hydrogen are precisely named noble gases because they are phase conjugators optically. Absolutely.
And phase conjugation allows for theoretically unlimited electricity.
If the implosive charge collapse becomes broad spectral,
which is what the pyramids do.
Well, the pyramids are tuned to low frequencies, but they can reach up to kilohertz, as we proved in measurements in Bosnia. But to reach up to optical, et cetera, then you have these plasma devices, which is the logo they inscribed on the carvings on the pyramid walls. They carved pictures of plasma devices. And incidentally, then later when Bob Dretsch did our microwave emission scanning, and you could scan the spine for the microwave and measure Kundalini of ATP. Then he showed that the Earth grid was profoundly symbiotic to cellular microwave adenosine diphosphate 1.91 angstroms, and not only the Earth grid profoundly symbiotic to cellular microwave, the physics of DNA radio, but also then he showed that the microwave coherence of the carvings on the pyramid walls, the reason the insects navigate by that microwave, hint, the insect antennae are all exactly tuned to phase conjugate microwave. And I work with Callahan also on that, so it's a rich subject.
EVOs themselves are spontaneous vacuum polarizations. Like Ken Shoulders says, name anything good, and these objects will basically do it for you.
Yeah, that basically the name for when the vacuum self-organizes is the name for charge collapse. Physics calls that entanglement, but they don't realize entanglement perfected is only a name for phase conjugation, which is embedding perfected.
So what's the origin of that node then? Sal Paez, he has an equation C to the fourth over big G. Is that kind of the original embedding of any electron or hydrogen anu atom?
I'd like to study that equation. I would comment more generally that when Leadbeater and Besant, and I knew some of those people, first saw the anu, 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, they didn't know that was only a drawing of charge collapse, tetracube inside, pentodeca outside. That's what the anu is a drawing of. 5 spins inside, 7 spins outside. That's a name for tetracube outside and dodecicos inside. So they were essentially drawing a graphic from their imagination of what was represented, in fact, by a nest of platonics, which is not only how Kepler knew planetary orbitals worked, and he was right, charge collapse, but it's also specifically the only geometry by which electron shells make the atomic table. It's only a nest of platonic solids, and it's the only nest of platonic solids exactly precisely, which is the nuclear hadrons, as chemist Moon proved. So the anu was a name for the physics of charge collapse only, hello, which is the perfect slipknot of implosion. So yeah, and then later in the physics literature, and Phillips, who wrote the book Psi Perception of Quarks, I knew him somewhat, who justified the anu subatomic clairvoyance of Leadbeater and Besant with current subatomic physics literature and proved 3 anu per quark and the whole thing fit together perfectly. These were little slipknots which were self-aware, and they were impish, joyful, and mischievous. Although, if you look at the anu in aluminum, they're unhappy as hell. Maybe you can guess why.
Mm-hmm. And then to wrap it up here, Sal Paez, he has this clip where he says the physics of creation, implosion, and then he talks about mass energy in some of his papers. The way I understand it is the energy coming off of mass is like the electron orbital, where it's constantly fed from the vacuum. It's not the radiated Planck center.
No, the feed for the charge collapse is the radiated Planck center, specifically. That's the little black hole. Even Nassim knew it was a black hole, but he didn't know it had to be Planck-fired black hole. That's the feed for the charge distribution. So everything is nourished only when it's imploding to charge collapse accurately. Otherwise, the whole array starts to dissemble.
Wow.
Which is why, the book Earthing works. If you don't get grounded, hello, you're going to die.
Thank you. If I actually, real quick, you said anybody that knows this stuff is threats to national security. I brought it up a few times. Here we have some people in here that if we got together could make some gravity machines over Unity machines.
Yeah, we could. But we can't actually, we know that we cannot do that until a government is on our side. In the meantime, we make all kinds of other wonderful fun toys, and we tease the government.
That's not fair. I'm going to... Okay.
Otherwise, you get dead pretty quick.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And I appreciate that dynamic. And I know Tic-Tac, you had your hand up, so get to you here next. And then I haven't seen anybody else with their hand up, but Ashton requested to speak, and I'm sure he has some great knowledgeable questions from what I've gathered of Ashton. He's been genuinely seeking, to understand physics and these whole dynamics. A lot of it's surrounded around the MH370 videos, but through that, he's been able to integrate a lot of just understanding physics. And so I've really appreciated the way he dialogues with people. I'm excited for him to ask a question as well. So Tic-Tac, go ahead, and then Ashton.
Well, the last statements, I don't really want to know if I want to share, but I'll ask a question about the swinger limit, because I have a lot of ideas on how these quantum effects are created. But pretty much what you're talking about, the collapse or implosion, is that not essentially the electron manipulation by like infrared lasers?
Electron manipulation by infrared lasers? Well, I know, for example, ourfirecrystal.com, which is a super powerful healing piezo quartz crystal. It's the Atlantean fire crystal reborn, responds to the breath and phase conjugate pump waves, etc. Now, when you zap that with the right ultraviolet, or parallel, I'm sure, infrared. So if you get the infrared, a phase conjugate pump wave can exist in almost any spectra, and certainly ultraviolet and infrared is part of that, as in, for example, insects' use of ultraviolet. So that would fit together. I see the Schwinger limit is a scale above which the electromagnetic field is expected to become nonlinear. When they say nonlinear, I think they actually mean implosive. So this is getting very parallel to the idea of charge collapse.
If you see I posted some pictures up in the comment section down there. If you see the infrared and different infrared spectrums doing different stuff to electrons, like it can manipulate the helium electron, and then you have an immense discharge of a like zeptosecond, UV spectrum pulse. That's why I'm thinking, is that the implosion or the electron discharge or EMF discharge that you were mentioning? Is that how that's produced in what you're working with?
Well, I'm not sure there's an answer, but you might have given me an excuse to tell one of my favorite stories, so that, when they teach the Steiner kids, if they visualize a rose, first they draw a rose, and they visualize the rose accurately enough with their eyes closed. And the test, if they have succeeded, is if the room fills with the smell of roses. And then later, when we learn from Callahan, who I worked with for years, that olfaction is mediated largely in the infrared. So the brain was literally imploding like a rose and spitting out the infrared, which I came to believe when that hummingbird kept slamming into the window when our lady friend was having bliss in a sealed house. The infrared got through, and the hummingbird was looking for the flower.
Well, I was just, the infrared in that picture is kind of like what you had mentioned, your pulse. That is kind of your pulse that excites. Then the discharge of the zeptosecond beams in certain materials could have quantum vortices, and then be filtered through left and right-handed lenses with negative refractive indexes. And therefore, you're manipulating the time. Plus having the benefits of massive ion flow through maybe some of those helium-4 embedded lattices. And maybe with that and spin, who knows what you can do. I mean, radiation pressure is really never talked about. And I think just that zeptosecond pulse, the power from that alone is or are estimated to be in petawatt lasers like 300 or 30 petapascals, which is immense for a very brief period of time. But just the lift pressure that could be exerted on materials, I don't even know how you could harness something like that, but maybe gyroscopically.
But again, my field here would be the biology where biology uses that. And we know that the implosion we're calling bliss has a huge infrared component. And we know that that implosion then would cascade to very shortwave harmonics, meaning access to the what you're calling petasecond, the very short pulses. So obviously you need an implosive system in order to coherently couple with those very short events. And finally, I would comment, the reason we know that we in some cases had to turn the power down at phi-ray.com to avoid time distortion events, we know the physics because time distortion was simply a name for the experience of the rate of spin, actually, and your ability to couple with very short rates of spin that when you implode them. And that's how we did it. We got a very high number of golden ratio harmonics exactly tuned to Planck. And when they cascade implode, that implosive vortex gives you access to a very short wave event structure, what you're calling quanta. And so that ability to experience a relationship to very short spin events, time distortion events, is literally like the donut torus called a photon. When you accelerate it, you think it's aging faster, but what's doing, it's simply spinning faster because some of there's translation vorticity of acceleration is converted into rotation rate, which is named time.
Right, and that can also be done through the actual those negative refractive index lenses that could be on the output of this helium embedded lattice, let's just say, that would produce ultraviolet.
Yes.
And then impinging on maybe your piezoelectric, maybe from hitting a titanium plate, which would produce massive EMP plus the pressure against your piezoelectric. Maybe it would be like a threefold increase and change in harmonics just from that driven IR pulse being the push is
Yeah, essentially phase conjugation perfected. For example, the helium would be a phase conjugator too as a noble gas, and embedding the plate means you're hitting some form of phase conjugate mirror in this. And phase conjugate is essentially a name for a vortex which efficiently connects short waves to long waves. That's what it's a name for, which is then where you get the quantum effects and quantum coherence. So yeah, this stuff all fits together. And I think we have equations now to perfect that, now that we understand how Planck-Fire.com works, which is if you ain't tuned to charge collapse, it ain't going to be efficient.
These radiation pressures have many different names like Coulomb's law, van der Waals forces, Lorentz invariants. But I was wanting to hear what Ashton has to say because he knows a lot about negative radiation.
Hey, what's up, guys? Hey, Mr. Winter. Pleasure to talk to you. Been listening to some of your stuff in the background. You're one of the people that people ask me the most about in terms of what I think about you and why haven't I talked to you. And I tell people I think you're probably right on the money. And after listening to you for the last hour or so, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. Feels like, I mean, from my own opinion and my own research into a lot of this stuff, you explain it pretty well for people that understand the science already. Like I'd say it's kind of an advanced level in terms of 0 point energy. And I think the rotation stuff that you talk about is really interesting. The idea that time is just spinning faster actually makes a lot of sense from an Newtonian physics perspective and action, the principle of action. So just a couple things. I have a lot of thoughts, but first is national security. So everything you're saying is real, of course, and then that means that this is a huge national security issue. Why? Because, well, free energy. And also, free energy then leads to gravity manipulation, which leads to warp drives and teleportation and moving things so fast that they can just annihilate another object, maybe even make a big bang. Who knows? But definitely a black hole, according to Salvatore Pais's patents. So this led me to find people like Ken Shoulders, as you're very familiar with, and then find out that he weirdly worked with Hal Puthoff and Bill Church of Church's Chicken, and that in the late 80s and early 90s, they developed this condensed charge technology, which based on this conversation, my own research, et cetera, I would call condensed charge technology like the God particle. Like we figured out everything you could possibly conceive of. It's the Ark of the Covenant, the thing that we need to enable magical effects. And I think that Hal Puthoff knows, and he's hiding it for national security. I want to know what your opinions are on how Puthoff and Ken Shoulders working together, and if they really figured this out back in their early 90s. And then from a national security perspective, like, what is the right thing to do here? I mean, you can look at it from the perspective of people hiding it and say they're doing it for justified reasons. They don't want the planet to be destroyed. But at the same time, they're hiding free energy from the world. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, my friend Dave got involved with Hal Puthoff. Lots of friends know him who supposedly adopted him.
Dave Rossi?
Yeah, it got very messy, actually too messy. So I really very careful to avoid getting in bed with the military. Not that they're all evil, it's complicated. And supposedly, Puthoff wanted to adopt him and help him, but then it got military and then all these secrets. And so I don't want to go there in the conversation. But my approach had been to say, well, you might be a threat to national security, but if the only thing you're doing is explaining how your mind works. So when we measured repeatedly Jean-Charles Moyen's brainwaves just before he teleported repeatedly with witnesses, came back with sand between his toes, and we got that a perfect, gorgeous, off the chart brainwave coherence, golden ratio, alpha to gamma, off the charts. Had to turn down the gain. So we know exactly what his brainwaves were doing to make him teleport. This is a threat to national security, but it's also the physics of bliss. Hello, is bliss illegal? Well, it probably is in most countries. But if all you're doing is explaining the physics of bliss, hopefully they can't put you in jail. But the first Germans who figured out how to bounce radar off a periscope, they went to Russia. And Russia became the experts on phase conjugation. Wasn't taught in the USA at all. But actually, if the thickness of the paint is a super dielectric and a multiple of the wavelength of microwave, guess what's going to happen? Phase conjugation in the paint, which is going to non-destructively bounce. Hello. Oh, that's a threat to national security too. Also, but it's also obvious. So, and that's basically what made Nostradamus's mirror work,
So you're saying that the concept then, and I think you said this before, is that the loophole is that as long as you're just explaining concepts, they can't really stop you. I mean, how could they? But if you start building something that's, actually based on those concepts, that's where you take it too far. And, that's what I've learned as well. Now, in terms of taking it too far, let me ask you in terms of the science. I think the hardest thing to explain to people is this concept of negative entropy. But I think I understand it a little bit better after listening to you here today, which is this idea of this implosive force. I don't know if you would consider it extra dimensional in terms of this implosive force that happens. And is that then a black hole? Go ahead.
Extra dimensional was merely a name for the ability to add superposed rotations non-destructively, which obviously only golden ratio allows. So basically, it's another name for embedding in a larger vortex. That's what extra dimensional. That's all it means.
Yeah.
And the centripetal quality of that vortex. Remember, no one in physics on this planet knows why anything is centripetal. So give them a break. But for those who have a clue why objects fall to the ground, then you could start the conversation, which is when that vortex becomes implosive capacitively, hint, makes gravity, then that implosion causes all the charge to be forced through the same pine cone at center. And that pine cone at that center is going to say, no wave that's out of phase can go through. And that is named negentropy.
Interesting.
As in the Schumann phase conjugate pump wave making Gaia negentropic.
And so, okay, two questions on that. So then do you think that Schumann resonance or the frequency is related to 1 divided by 137?
The 1 over 137, there is an indirect relationship, but the direct relationship is definitely golden ratio specific.
Got it.
We wrote the equations to prove golden ratio is the generalized solution to constructive wave interference in general, and therefore the solution to compression in general. And therefore, the solution to gravity in general. The wave equations are published, planckfire.com.
Yeah, so it's just a matter of constructive and destructive interference is really the secret. But then what are the effect? Yeah, perfecting it. So the secret, so then the effects, one of the things that I've personally been trying to understand is whether or not we're dealing with effects that would be annihilation, like antimatter type effects, or if we'd be dealing with some effects that are like teleportation. So when you're dealing with this idea of like you can have this extra dimension that's like kind of being vortexed down in that we don't really perceive, if you go through that, if you go through a black hole or a wormhole or whatever you want to call it, singularity, are you just being annihilated? Are you being sent to a different dimension? Or is it just teleportation to somewhere else on this dimension where it's really like a bridge? What are your thoughts?
I think calling it next dimension is crude and not accurate enough. So I say specifically when Jean-Charles Moyet teleported, in this case, to the beach, he had to go to the beach because that was a longitudinal node. And he saw where he was going through one eye and where he was going through the other eye. And the reason that happened when his brain waves were phase conjugate imploding to Schumann at very high amplitude is that in the pineal, there was embedding into the array. He could not have done this in aluminum boxes. Never. No, if he had access to the coherent longitudinal array and you can embed in that array, the same way you embed in the array called your synapses, except it's a bigger array. And the ability to embed in a larger array, sometimes called lucid dreaming or successful death, requires that coherent compression at the point of embedding, which was happening in his pineal. So the vector coordinates which enabled him to pop out of that array, if you ask these lucid dreamers how they decide to where to pop out of the array and appear, or the astral projectors who are doing these astral battles, my partner, Jake at Astral Urma, now they're very specific about how they pop out of the array where. He was aiming for the pyramid. So specifically embedding into a coherent longitudinal array and knowing where to enter and exit from that array. It's a very specific coordinate-based physics that begins with compression and understanding the physics of the longitudinal array specifically. This vague matter of next dimension, that language just ain't helpful.
Yeah, I think it definitely is to some degree. Okay, well, so you're saying that it would you teleport somewhere else here on the same plane of existence, not necessarily many worlds.
But the plane of existence isn't even helpful either. You know, the biggest Stargate in our galaxy, for which most of the Orion wars were fought over, is the trapezium, which is a cube in Orion for a very specific reason. That's the biggest Stargate, because the more the harmonics that can implode in the phase conjugate vortex, the more the harmonics faster than the speed of light. So that's the Stargate that goes faster, and we know why it goes farther. So we know exactly what stargates are, and we have a far more specific language for that, which is the coherent longitudinal array. Just like Tony proved that the obelisks in Rome purified the rivers. They were on the array, and he explained, we know the physics of why that purified the river, documented in history, and why even the Eiffel Tower as a node in that array helped purify the river underneath it.
Thank you for the thoughts on that. So I just had one last thought, and thank you guys for letting me have a couple questions in here. Do you have any idea on how we might engineer quantum entanglement, as in engineer it for a resource where it would be something that we could use?
I think quantum entanglement is a lousy, inaccurate term, which should more precisely be called Planck-Fire phase conjugation to Planck. Quantum entanglement is a name for embedding perfected, which is perfected by planckfire.com specifically. So planckfire.com is the obvious generalized solution and is the definition of entanglement perfected, obviously, which means imploding into a node of the longitudinal array by that physics of charge collapse. Very specific. And that's the physics of all action at a distance, because the longitudinal node then will only bounce and exchange inertia then with transverse only at another node in the array, which is why the dodecacosa Earth grid is not only the only physics of telepathy, but it's the only physics of critical mass reduction.
Okay, thank you, sir. I appreciate it, and appreciate all the thoughts in general. I'm going to go back to just listening.
Thank you for your intelligent questions, sir.
Yeah, great dialogue, guys. Appreciate you coming up and engaging, Ashton, and Dan. Just that whole dialogue was fantastic. And that, and both of you guys too. I'll just put another note too. Both of you putting out the works you do at the risk that you do. I know both of you are on topics here that are countercultural in some ways, although both of you over time in your own ways. Ashton, more newer on the scene, but very vocal, and as you can tell, very knowledgeable and great engaged. And Dan, you've been doing it for decades, and so you guys have helped shift the Overton window that we can even discuss these things like this the way we can, and really setting the foundation for the next generation to grow up that with a free mindset, that free energy or energy even from the ambient field or whatever, access to energy outside of what we've been told is accessible and doable by even your average everyday person. So I think this is very important.
If I can add on that real quick, it's easy to push fusion energy because that's already possible and willingly allowed, I guess. That's out there, fusion, and then the understanding of the electric universe or something like that, because there's like a unified field out there and it goes by many names, but it's a lot different than Einstein. So if we can at least push that, I mean, that's an understanding that won't get us killed, right?
Well, and it's not illegal to talk about the physics of human bliss. And human bliss process, hint, golden ratio in EEG and in the spinal liquid pump and in the HRV, is precisely probably the universe's best example of a 0-point energy device.
How in the hell is talking about open source studies and quantum effects a threat to national security? I don't get it.
Well, you know, it's a dumb plan.
And I've always prefaced that I am definitely at a dummy level for physics. You know what I'm saying? I'm just now starting to learn concepts of this, but I don't see how, because nobody wants to talk about it. It's like trying to give somebody AIDS. It's like they don't want to touch it, but they'll talk about everything else around it. But they won't go into the stuff that's already out there in science that's proven with all the frequencies, with all the, how it's done and how they're replicating it. I just don't get it.
I always like the example of, yes, it may be illegal to talk about electrogravitics, but if you know that the TM meditators, thousands of high-res pictures of them floating, they mostly do it under a gold dome, which is called implosive capacitance. Is that a clue?
Just to back off of Tic Tac guy's question.
No, don't get me killed, bro.
What do you think of, let's just say, either through like a bait and switch type mechanism or by actual research, China puts out these ideas?
Most of the studies that I have referenced, half of them are from Chinese studies that have shown that they've replicated these type of quantum effects of, literally splitting the red and blue shift. It's out there. And it's been from studies from other countries too. It's not like this is new, and it is a new area. I'll give you that. It's all quantum stuff is all new, but it's being studied by every country.
Yeah, it's funny that when Bearden first published that coherent directional longitudinal EMF is the only definition of a gravity wave, nobody took him seriously. But now, if you learn how to squirt a coherent directional longitudinal EMF, you have made gravity. Hello.
And I feel like we're some of the few people in here that recognize what you're saying there is massive. So just to reiterate, what do you think of China doing this?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. Obviously, they're a very evolved culture, and yet they don't empower democracy or individual rights. So there's a lot of issues there that I think we do need. I mean, the sacred idea of human freedom and independence is sacred for a very good electrical reason. And for that reason, I think there is reason for concern in a government which doesn't respect individual rights or democracy, that there are electrical issues to that.
I might want to jump. Can I jump in there?
Yeah, hold on just a sec, Tom. We've been going an hour and 20. Dan, did you want to take a quick break or anything on your end? I know I've been muted and taking my own breaks.
Let me do a 2 minute. 2 minutes, sorry.
Absolutely, get there.
Yeah. Okay.
And then we got, when he gets back, now Tom had his hand up for quite a long time. And then Nathaniel, under the Hex account, you had your hand up too. And 7 ounces up here too. He hasn't said anything. So I want to give you guys opportunity in that order. And then
sorry about that, Tom. Sorry about that, Tom. I just wanted to say that, I asked coming from a perspective of actually wanting to make things that, like we've been saying, are already out there and are beneficial to humanity. So it's I don't know what kind of double-edged sword it is. Dan Winter's saying China's not the place, even though they're doing the cool stuff. No other government's going to help us. It's a little bit depressing. I was kind of hope Dan Winter would give us more of a, I don't know. My bad. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, if you ask me, I think China issued a key LENR paper. So I think, my comment, and I think Dan already knows this, so we don't have to wait for him, is that I think, the main message is the narrative control. And I think that's where Ashton provides a valuable service, whether the videos are real or not, just looking at the topic and looking at the papers and looking at the science breaks down the narrative control around the science. And, my question to Dan is going to be, exactly like you guys have been hitting the last 3 or 4 speakers, what are the barriers that we're looking at here, like the woo lines? Because I think Dan is safe because he's behind the consciousness woo line and he's just a new age wooer, right? And the physics link, isn't quite there yet. But, what are all the barriers that need to be broken down and how might we break down those barriers? And just for you, Ashton, because I think we already threw this at Dan last week, but my physics is that you're actually on the event horizon, and that's all there is an event horizon of consciousness, and it's got a certain duration and thickness, and nothing moves because it's a very holographic kind of a loop. Quantum gravity is one way to describe it. I think you're going to have different math and physics you can use to describe it, but it is basically a pixel concept with a white hole inside, the black hole's outside, and in between is the event horizon. So the rest mass is really an artifact of some of the deeper physics, not a fundamental thing. And that's, I think, where you come back to the mind-body stuff and the philosophy, because we have this very materialist view of the world, and it's very much based on a rest mass. I need the billiard ball in my hand to understand things. So I don't know if we have Dan back or yet.
Yeah, so I'll jump in real quick on that because, I think that you're right, is that we have this view that stuff is everywhere and that stuff has tangible and has weight. But what we're finding out is that stuff doesn't actually really have any intrinsic weight to it or mass to it. In reality, that mass only exists because of the field and the energy field that we're in, this fishbowl of energy that we're in. Now, why is that so huge from a perspective? From a consciousness perspective, you guys can delve into that. Obviously, yes, there's huge implications for what it means to exist and what consciousness means. But from a physics perspective, the reason why that has to be covered up is pretty apparent. Because if there is energy all around us like that, it's not so much that distance is an illusion, which it is. That's huge, but you don't need to cover that up. What you need to cover up is that you can tap into that. That's a reservoir of energy, just like an oil well might be out there, except for in this case, it's infinite energy. So why are we talking about China and why are we talking about national security? Because it's a weapon beyond anything that humanity has ever seen before, and we haven't yet seen it, because if we do, it'll be our annihilation. And why are we talking about China? Because we're developing it, China's developing it, Russia's developing it. No one wants to say anything because you're developing a doomsday weapon.
And if I may, just that if human bliss is the ultimate way to access that, the ultimate power then lies with it. And just one more last koan from the previous conversation was detailed stories of the last days of Atlantis. Millions had been deprived of freedom because of misuse of fire crystal technology. And a direct result of depriving millions of freedom was gravity destabilization. There's a koan.
So it definitely seems to be an intrinsic connection to personal responsibility, basically, and self-agency and self-freedom, to the coherence also of technology, especially if we're talking about a global level where they're in resonance bioharmonically with their own physiology and then the core frequencies of the planet.
That's right. And so if you're really grounded, basically that means only if you're feeling for the planet as a whole, as a living body, which is pretty much the definition of bliss, do you get to navigate not only yourself, but the planet.
Tom had a question here and I want him to jump in, but real quick, what does it mean to live on an iron range where they're taking all the iron out of the earth then?
the iron is so magnetically conductive that it's very good for blood circulation. And the indigenous people knew that the removal of the key minerals was a tragedy for the ancestor memory in the land. Very deep metaphor. I live next to an iron-rich mountain. The town I lived in is named for iron. And Takadama, Adam and Eve, Adom was named for the redness of iron. And Skandinavia, Skanda, was named for the redness of iron. And the difference between chlorophyll and hemoglobin as blood is iron. And Enki decided to do the experiment on us because he was interested in the iron in the blood. So very rich metaphor.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, we don't have Science Bob. I'm not sure if it was in one of these spaces or another space, but I think he put it pretty eloquently, which is, I think you can talk a lot about the physics as long as you avoid the 4D to 5D coupling mechanism and some of these resonances and harmonics that might be able to be used for bad reasons, right? But I think we want to dance as close as we can, up to that. Now, one thing I'm wondering about, if you put out the full particle stack calculation, then that's once again, that might be showing too much, right? So I think on the civilian side, it's a little bit awkward because of the narrative control. There's no conversation with the Black Project side, which makes it, I think, a volatile thing. And I think that's what the National Science Foundation has to change. And that's where it's destabilizing, I think, frankly, to have China coming out with papers when the United States is sitting on stuff that's similar. Although I will say within the last 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, there's been a ton of stuff, rotating universe, white hole, and the black hole, that's been in the sweet spot of a lot of our conversations. So I think that veil's coming down a little bit. But the question, Dan, is if you could just a couple seconds on, what are the barriers that you've come up against, and you've kind of done an artful way of staying inside the womb lines for self-protection, but you don't want to stay inside there forever. So kind of what are some of the barriers from your deep experience, and then any strategies we can use to break them down?
Yeah, I know many engineers. Our friend turned down a job at China Lake, and he was permanently banned. It's just a disaster the way the military steals 2/3 of the invention.
They do great work there, though. They do great work, and some of it's public.
Yeah, and yet if you say no and they want you, anyway. But let's not go there. One comment I would like to make is, when the SSP experiencers come back from the 20 and back in 60, and Penny was 60 back, and Penny came back, and she explained in far more detail why it wasn't iron powder, but it was bismuth that made the mercury in the vortex gravity making of the Nazis make gravity. Well, these people, they've been there, they've seen it, they know, and they're telling the stories. And the government doesn't have any control over that because there's hundreds of SSP people that are back with the stories. So
I think that's part of it too, just the narrative of the people eventually overtaking the narrative
critical mass. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And I wanted to jump in for 2 seconds. Hey, Dan, it's Russell. Wanted to really just say to everybody, to remind everybody, we can go down these rabbit holes and all the fear mongering, or why is there this country or this superpower that is, be fearful, be weary. But always remember, at the end of the day, at the end of the game, all the chess pieces go into the same box, as I always state. And that if we talk about that there is no distance or time, that this is all an illusion, that right now the key, the chi, the energy, is to be the best you can be. As if this power, as in activation, bliss, going the extras, the super sapien, if that is how we steer, then that is what we have to get to. Then everything to that, all the fear or the sadness, the emotion, the spectrum that we are able to do with this new vessel that we are currently inhabiting, that is just like a diamond or just like a gem, like it needs compression. And that compression that we're having from the pushes of the fear, of the emotions, of everything that we're seeing right now, the mysticism, the game, the movie, the action, the thriller, the climax that we are building. So this is beautiful. We are the 0.00001% here right now, doing this co-creation, being on X with Dan, the one world-renowned in his field. This is beautiful. So appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Russ.
Yes.
You're beautiful. Thank you, Russ.
Love and blessings.
Love and blessings.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, bro. Go ahead, Nathaniel, Hex, and then 7.
Oh, hey, thanks. And I really enjoyed the direction of this conversation. I do have one clarifying question that I'm trying to get at, basically, and it's the nature of what I think we're talking about with this kind of like coherence at the center when we talk about linear or cohering matter, and this centripetal force too, I think. So the question is, when you talk about a coherent longitudinal array, would that concept match with a nested torus system?
Yeah. Well, what we're saying is that obviously all fields are toroidal, and when you superpose them, you can't get beyond tetracube without superposing, embedding, rotating that in dodecacosa, which is the geometry of hydrogen, DNA, every living protein, and Planckfire.com. So that is the perfect array, which is the perfect superposition of toroids, which is the perfect charge distribution enabler in general. And remember that the longitudinal component, as it spits out, will only bounce at and affect anything else in the array at other nodes in that array. Everything else is transparent to the longitudinal wave. For example, a Faraday cage has no effect. But at the next longitudinal node in the array, visualize dodecacosa star mother kit, then there is some inertia possible exchange there with the transverse, which is why that defines the ability to contain heat at a distance, the holy grail of fusion research, because in the longitudinal node, the other node of that array. So if Tesla could have calculated where the nodes were accurately based on Planckfire.com, he might have succeeded with global wireless power, for example. But it is all about the perfected array, as hydrogen's geometry I proved is exactly Planck-Fire, golden ratio times Planck. You extend that, you get all arrays and all longitudinal interferometry and all ancestor memory song lines.
I'm wondering if that is something like a yes there to the idea of nested toruses. It seems like you could have over-tors and sub-tors in a constant nest. And that's
Sure.
like it could be a lattice of nodal points per se. But I'm just trying to understand, like maybe our time travel teleportation works by moving through this so-called lattice array. I'm just trying to synthesize all the language. And,
yes. Yeah. In other words, Planckfire.com defines the ability to superpose rotations in general, because it defines the only way an infinite number of harmonics can exist at one node, golden ratio times Planck only. And that is the interconnectivity perfected defined, which means only at nodes of that array. And the more compressed the nodes of that array, the further you can travel through the portal in both time and space. That basically, when you get more compression at a node of that array, you get more multiples times the speed of light, which is why, for example, global instantaneous communication was pioneered by Hartmut-Mueller's golden ratio based longitudinal. This is instantaneous communication defined. It is telepathy defined. It's how you get to the Stargate in Orion defined. Absolutely.
I was just going to say this leads to literal stargates. You can
absolutely
impedance match the light wavelengths.
They use the Ophanium-Enochian alphabet to make the movie Stargate for good physics. This is superposed dodecacosa shadows of the spiral. We did the physics of the Ophanium-Enochian alphabet and its hypercube superpositions of tetracubic Hebrew. You know, we know why that alphabet made the movie.
Yeah. So can I ask, why was that soft disclosure?
I would call it soft disclosure, hard disclosure. And it's literally like a window pane, you know, and they saw that in the time mirror and all these time devices. It's actually in the slideshow today, that at the phase conjugate point, you get this liquid surface, and it is a superfluid. And when you step through there, if you survive the compression and you distribute in the array, and you damn well better have calculated the entry and immersion points, and you damn well better have the send point and the receive point, both at equivalent nodes in the array. And by the way, when we do healing at a distance with plasmafire.com, we tell people you need to be at a node, a cross point, and the magnetic line crosses. That is the physics of healing at a distance.
And so I just had one follow-up, which is just about this coherent matter and coherence. And please understand what I'm trying to do is use the language of many other fields that are so-called advanced and work them into the concepts and this understanding. And so I'm asking about the concepts behind what they call terms to see if it, can be understood this way. And because I think this is a pretty holistic view. And so, I don't think that Lockheed is telling us everything, but in their patent of the coherent matter wave beam, I put a link in the pill down at the bottom under this hex account. It'll just say simply patents. I should have posted better and said what it was, but they talk about resonant cavities, and that's the point, I believe. And having a field arrangement with a electric field current that is polarized with a cross perpendicular magnetic current. And I don't understand what's going on here, but I know that it's key because there's a lot of cavities and there's something that seems to be building up within them based on frequency. And this is a public patent, so I think it's fair to talk about. And I think if we can get to what they're doing, that's what's happening in Leonard. That's also, something that's open and available for us to improve on and learn from, I think. So that's why I'm trying to get at this.
Very appropriate, and I respect your study there, and I haven't looked at the matter wave literature. I would comment that obviously it's a resonant cavity of a cross wave. Probably another language for this would be longitudinal embedding, and obviously matter itself is a name for a coherence phenomena, obviously. Well, how do you make it more coherent? Well, you embed it in a longitudinal array, and LENR, again, pretty obviously, is a name for non-destructive isotope transition, which is another name for non-destructive charge collapse. And we have the equations for every commercially useful isotope transition in the whole atomic table. And it starts with those calculations. For example, aluminum to silver, we have the we have the equations. It's a long story. So we know what LENR is. It's a name for non-destructive charge collapse, which is effectively the definition of the chem and alchemy access to a black hole, which means how do you do charge collapse? And we even think we know the phonons John D. and Kelly used when they made the purest gold ever measured by the British Royal Society. They used the powder of the Kaba stone, which was a super dielectric Lucifer's eye. It was a glass meteorite which had impregnated platinum group metals as a vapor, which made it a super dielectric. And that was called the philosopher's stone. It was a permissive dielectric for charge distribution, which is the definition of philosopher's stone in alchemy. So it is all about charge collapse.
And just one more quick point to clarify, if I have this understanding, in this longitudinal array, understood, I hope appropriately as just in the language of a fractal toroidal geometry. You don't have to adopt Grenier's language, but I'm trying to use that understanding. In that longitudinal array, we could say that the longitudinal alignment is something like an overtor of another order structure, perhaps.
Yes. For example, action at a distance and healing works better if you do it at sunrise, sunset. Now that's the next longer wave superposed at a right angle. Now if you do it at equinox and solstice, and now if you do it when the galactic equator lines up, and now if you do it so each time a longer wave is superposed, you get access to a bigger electric field, absolutely. And you inhabit a bigger array. That's called going to the next dimension. It's literally called evolution of consciousness.
Okay, thank you. I'll rest it there. I appreciate it, and I'm asking for clarification and to check intuition. So thanks very much.
Just an example of that: the physics of Agnihotra, proven for fertility and reduction of nuclear radiation, for example. Agnihotra works better at sunrise and sunset for very specific electric reasons, which is embedding in the longitudinal array for sure, and that applies then to remote viewing and telepathy. So longitudinal nodes are everything.
Hi, Dan. This is Anne-Marie Bell. I've got one of your Therify devices. I've had it forever with my twins who have autism. I think you probably remember. We were the first ones to use it. They're doing phenomenal, by the way. It's been now like almost 5 years, and we're super excited to get your Phi-Ray. And so I'm wondering, I've continued to question this. Have you considered combining 3 or 4 devices together as opposed to 2, and what would happen with that, with the energy fields, if we were to triangulate that energy?
So, for example, with the pair of plasma tubes in Therify, people did experiment with using 4 instead of 2, etc. And there was some law of diminishing returns, some increase in the power of that field. Obviously, and it was useful. It wasn't breakthrough, but it was useful. Now, with the PhiRay.com, that field is so strong. Our biggest concern is that you turn it down. Believe me, you don't need more tubes. No, no, no. No, what we did is we put more harmonics at higher amplitude and added the magnetics. This thing is this, I mean, have people getting involuntary Kundalini. This PhiRay thing, my biggest concern about PhiRay.com is that it's too strong. Hey, believe me, you're not gonna need anything more. No, start at low power, please. That's all.
Oh, I'm so excited to purchase it. This is like, I can't wait to purchase it. So yeah, we'll be getting one ASAP.
And you know that we think the effect on autism, our friend in South Africa pioneered some of that work, that basically the armoring is a key part of the physics of autism, in that the person delays the arrival of stimulus. So if you put headphones that delay your mother's voice by a few milliseconds, the autistic child that could not hear suddenly begins hearing. So one aspect of armoring was simply the mechanical delay of signal arrival to avoid pain. Well, armoring is another example of not enabling the phase lock of perception itself. So implosion, in this sense, restored compression, is by definition the opposite of autism. In fact, those, they call them cattle restraints they use as therapy for autism, is literally another definition of the perfect squeeze. It's the same as the physics of radical rebirthing. If you recreate the electrical circumstance of the perfect birth canal, all memory is restored. That's implosion.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. And again, I mean, one of my twins who just walked through the room with the Therify device on, they were completely nonverbal, having seizures every 1 to 2 minutes, these micro seizures. That next day, he said his first word once again, whom had not ever spoken since, after all of his vaccinations. So yeah. I am completely, I mean, we share this device with everyone and they're doing phenomenal. So I owe you the world. Thank you for creating this.
Thank you for being there. We have a website about autism and plasma there, and it's because of people like you. But basically, the climax of perception is the focal point of implosion. That's the definition. So restored perception obviously is access to that implosion. So it's pretty simple. Thank you, dear. Thank you. Blessings.
I have a speculation on that dynamic. So one of the things I've come across in autism research over the years, there was a mother who, saw it come on severely very quickly after, I think, around antibiotics, broad spectrum antibiotics. And so a lot of the research she did was pinning down to an overabundance potentially of a certain bacteria. So she finally got permission to get a specific antibiotic strain of this overabundance in the gut, and all the autism signs went away. And it just because of a change in my gut microbiome. Now, I don't have those articles referenced. I definitely remember reading at some point. It'd be cool if someone found that, posted that below, or look into that more. That's a whole avenue. But in connection to the PhiRay, with it, especially with the wand, so it sounds like you've incorporated, we're talking about magnetics like PEMF technology, basically just with the right frequencies, and that directional wand where you can put on certain parts of the body. So I wonder if the harmonizing effect of those cascading implosive Schumann resonances just help create a biostasis or a space for the body to restore homeostasis, basically bringing to balance gut microbiome, which we know affects serotonin release in the brain and all other effects, a bunch of other effects as well. And I suppose I'll throw that in there.
Yes. Well, that's nice. And we know gut microbiome is related to the access to grounding, earthing, for example, which basically the implosion of the axis to charge collapse of the perfect Schumann. And that magnetic coil is literally only precisely exactly the perfect Schumann cascade, just more golden ratio harmonics at rather high amplitude. So the magnetic field cocoon, pure Schumann, I think, is like cathedral center implosive. And I just got off the phone with a guy who had dramatic success with his arthritis in his hand with that, et cetera. So restored space is a good name for it, because the implosion really creates a space for the distribution into the array. Yes.
Yeah, and just that picture imagery right there. And then I know you have some, Chief, and then Tom. But yeah, creating like a cavern, the healing chambers, the things we see in a lot of the ancient structures, but the device kind of creating space for that in the body, which allows things. Because I mean, even fasting, I just came off a prolonged water fast here, and one of the reasons I've done many fasts, is for that reason, kind of allowing the body to achieve homeostasis, free from chemicals and even just food input, right? Just external environments. So having devices that also create like a endogenous space for the body to do its thing, basically, sounds awesome.
Yeah, the people have often called it a feeling of the perfect cocoon.
I was going to say, in terms of the phi ray, that's literally just, and the Theraphi, it's increasing your metabolism's burn rate broad spectrumly through your entire body by basically tuning into all the hydrogen frequencies and different things like that in your body already.
Yeah, I mean, metabolic rate is, in a way, a name for charge circulation increase, and circulation perfected is what we do, both nervous and liquid, so yes. And there is a metabolic increase often, and a bliss effect sometimes, and that's why too much can have a dehydrating effect also. But conversely, the many stories of shrinking tumors, I have to say this is anecdotal, but there are many, are also related to that dehydration effect.
Mr. Wolf speaks to this. And then I was going to relate that back to the pyramid real quick, because even though they did find cavities per se, there are some anomalous effects that could just be from longitudinal signals, right?
Yes, it's all about the perfect cavity for sure.
Pudding. Cool. Tom?
Well, it's kind of a perfect segue, because first I just want to say, Royalty, I thought that was a great comment you made. And I think that's what I love about these conversations, is they capture so many areas that are normally cut off from each other. But, Nathan, I think you're really like directly over the target, right? So I guess our philosophy has to be, we follow the papers that are being let out very closely, because it is about the cavities and the residences and the toroidal structures. And then that's where it comes back to the pixel definition. And then that's where I think the multiple couchy surfaces is kind of the key. And just to throw it back to you, Dan, I know we kicked it around before, but maybe since Ashton is here, could you comment, if my theory is that the vacuum is not stable, so that it's a very rapid false vacuum collapse, and that the atom itself is not stable, but consciousness kind of stabilizes the atom. And that's where the fine structure constant is kind of interesting, because it's kind of the stabilization factor of consciousness itself into these quantized, moments of consciousness. Would you say if my kind of event horizon vacuum collapse physics, it harmonizes with your, let's call it, theory of mind? Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think we like each other's language here. I started with when Bill Tiller proved that focused human attention causes charge to compress. I was the first to explain why. So you cannot know what causes mass to exist unless you know what made a centripetal force that'll enable charge to rotate. So in effect, if you don't know what made the atom centripetal, namely gravity, you don't know why there's gravity, then you cannot know why there's mass, because you cannot know what enables charge to rotate, because the center would not hold. So the same thing that made the hydrogen atom centripetal is what makes your mind centripetal. And in both cases, it is charge collapse. And that's what gives you leverage, first over a little tornado and then a big tornado. So we're talking the same language here. It's literally, and that's why when our friend Jake, who's doing these astral battles with the Urma, he bought flameinmind.com so his brainwaves could get more implosive, because he knew in the mind meld with the Draco Orion Queen, it feels like a vice around your skull. The most powerful guy is the one who's most centripetal electrically, and that's very literal.
And I'll just throw one more in there, because I think a lot of people don't realize Einstein was working on some unified field stuff along these lines. So I just think it's interesting you can have, and that's where I think Jacques Sarfati's work, will hopefully, bear fruit. He might be a good way to kind of have an open source progress, Nathan.
The universe is literally a cellular structure, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's why.
I wondered just if I could ask one more clarification question about the time travel thing in a way of understanding it in this array.
Go ahead. Yes.
So I would take it to be something like another node within a larger harmonic that contained within it. So being able to, so that extra dimension, say, would be going to like an overtor position where you can drop back down to a relative subtor of that. So you're going from subtor to overtor back down to subtor, and being able to access, the lattice, so to speak, from being able to achieve resonance with like the larger overtor, and moving down to a more finer one again. Does that make sense? Or is that
let's talk about practical descriptions we have of time travel from many experiencers here. First of all, they emphasize it's often soul fractionating. It's actually literally dangerous for the soul. And also, fractionating timelines is one of the biggest dangers the Templars ever talked about, if you know Thoth. So keeping the timelines in a fractal is very critical, and there's some high-level soldiers that work on it. But anywho, practical example, if you have a very intense emotion, you leave a shadow, a fingerprint in time, which is then a node which is more accessible. So at these compression points, then you could use that as a node to come and go to. But time travel, first of all, in the future is messier than time travel in the past. In time travel in the past, there's all kinds of very strict laws so you don't mess up the future.
I mean specifically in this like teleportation scheme, like somewhere else immediately at say the same time or just within an hour. Well, what do you think about that?
When Jean-Charles Moyen repeatedly, he started out by going to the beach, which is a good longitudinal node. And also his lover was involved a few times, so it was good emotion leverage. And then we measured his brainwaves. Incredibly powerful EEG implosion, phase conjugate to Planck, exactly. So he was squeezing in to embed in the array at one node and emerging at another with the harmonics in between stacked and lined up in a perfect crystal of compression for sure.
And how about this, Nathan? You could think about it. What if the surfaces are like the frames in a movie reel and the reel is spooled? So how you calculate hopping from frame to frame? If you're moving in a normal linear way, you're traveling along the direction of the spool. But if you're traveling perpendicular, there might be a way of frame hopping. There might be a mathematics and a specifics to the frame hopping.
Which would probably be the superluminal component of the longitudinal golden ratio multiplies times the speed of light would time how fast you could propagate into that array. And the amount of compression would determine how far you could go.
And I think that's where the rotating universe stuff is interesting lately, because that was something Gödel was kind of studying independently.
Yeah. And it is about a nest of surfaces, which is where the phase locks occur.
And I brought it up a little bit earlier. C to the fourth divided by big G by Sal Paez.
I see. Yeah, I'd like to look at that more, but that's intriguing. Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. It's kind of funny. He also has a plasma patent for he has a patent for plasma compression, a fusion device, and I didn't know that, but Zap Energy also has a plasma compression fusion device, so it's kind of funny. Fusion again is one of these things I feel like is able to be talked about, but that's another topic.
The reason is because it's been big fusion so far, right?
Yeah.
You don't want anyone to have tabletop, right?
But actually, it's so simple. If you get the right phone on, I mean, Kansius has this glass of water, cold water, burning perfectly, and it's just longitudinal RF, exactly Planck fire frequency. That's all it is, and the cold water is burning perfectly. So that's LENR. Hydrogen is bouncing out of the water. Of course, that was just the hydrolysis, but it's an example of a longitudinal node is the physics of the charge collapse required.
Awesome. J.K. Philly?
Yes, I just had a quote here, and I wanted to see if you had maybe a comment. Larry Reed, in his preface with the quantum wave mechanics, he does talk about a little bit mass, and he had used these terms nodal. Wave energy packets are separated by nodes which obstruct energy flow, restricting propagation. Mass, this is the sentence here I really enjoy. Mass corresponds to wave periodicity and is the measure of EM wave volumetric nodal density. So that sounds familiar with what you're saying.
I like it. And mass is obviously a node in the array. That's for sure. It's compression success. But the nodes don't necessarily have to block propagation. It's like billiard balls in a row. The billiard balls in a row is an infinite dodecacosa. And if you bounce one billiard ball at one end and a billion billiard balls down the row, one bounces off faster than the speed of light, the array is distributing perfectly.
Great.
JK, if you look on page 262, complex numbers, literally he has two spheres in an incompressible fluid. And he says each sphere may be simulated by doublet flow delta Z, which is the longitudinal vector.
There you go. It's a compression component.
In the Helmholtz vortex, just going back to that, relates to vortexes in an incompressible fluid. I think, again, that's interesting. These things are rhyming.
Yeah, and compression perfected is basically what makes the node stable at center. And so whatever made it centripetal is what gave it leverage on the array. That's why you have to start with learning why anything is centripetal before you can talk about anything else intelligently.
So there, as a generality, it's understanding these phi ratio collapse mechanics that lead to, free energy devices, for an overarching term, CP accessing or ambient air, however you do that, but also anti-gravitics or just gravitics in general, being able to move, even create, I imagine, some kind of field within the ship that separates you from the inertia outside the ship. But is there also a way to hijack these frequencies to basically force the same effects, but not necessarily in a bioharmonic way?
Well, the theory would be that whether you were tuning the Mercury vortex, you would still use PlanckFire.com, where when you do it piezoelectrically with the Minkowski-Frost crystal, which made 800 times its own weight, the z-axis helical rotation was superposed again at Planck-Fire frequencies. And so the crystals imploding in both cases was spitting out coherent longitudinal directionally, and that was the crystal gravity motor. In both cases, if the density of that compression is great enough, then you will carry your own inertial field with you, meaning you can make, 1,000-mile-an-hour right-hand turns.
Larry Reed says, pulse compression decreases pulse interval and increases peak power. The spread in wavelength is proportional to momentum. So you can alter that within and without, or within the craft and outside the craft. Anything is engineerable.
When the waves are short enough, the high frequency component becomes broad spectral enough to, carry your own inertial field. That's why Minkowski used narrow spectra phase conjugation, and he got narrow amounts of negentropy. If you combine that electromagnetic with optical phase and use broad spectral phase conjugation, where the EE systems, for example, that's just you sit by television screens, those are narrow spectra phase conjugation.
Literally capable. Anything is capable of coupling or decoupling, basically.
That's right. And the broader the spectrum of the phase conjugation, the bigger the negentropy and the bigger the Stargate.
What do you think mirrors? Because they reference mirrors a lot in Larry Reed's book, and so do you.
Yeah, that's why learning why a phase conjugate mirror is key to the physics of clairvoyance and ancestor memory, et cetera, is instructive. That phase conjugate mirrors are a good introduction to the idea that at the node of the array where the pine cone kisses noses, and phase conjugate mirror is a name for a place where optics is charge distribution permissive enough to implode and pine cones can kiss noses accurately. So phase conjugate mirror is a name for a place where you can touch the longitudinal array. And a broad spectral phase conjugate mirror, that gets interesting.
What is a singular frequency resonant mirror cavity, like a Casimir cavity? What is that then?
The Casimir effect, they create attraction when the two metal plates are flat enough. Superconductivity. Here's an example. Tell me if this is an example. When you zap a gold monofilament or a DNA monofilament with amperage, like the moment when Daniel Brinkley died from lightning, that monofilament will become measurably superconductive. And the reason why it becomes measurably superconductive, whether it's a gold monofilament or a DNA monofilament, so Daniel Brinkley felt the emotions of everyone's life when he touched them, because he was literally a DNA superconductor after his lightning death. But the reason that gold and DNA monofilament became a superconductor was because its diameter was then an accurate integral multiple of the electron wavelength. There's a cavity.
So is scale invariance, quote, scale variance, basically like literal? Like we can think of our sun as a hydrogen atom itself?
Well, the heart of the sun, the heart of the human, the heart of hydrogen, that's the Anu, and that's been proven. So, but another way of saying it is scale invariance perfected is defined by PlanckFire.com.
What do you make of that as being the universal constant? Do you have any theories as to why that is? Is that engineered too? Is that
is the answer to that question the same as why Planck is the same for 1 million light years in all directions? It's because that defined the threshold at which transverse was converted to longitudinal and gravity was stabilized. So all gravity in the universe has to be tuned the same way. Forget the Big Bang explanation.
I'm just curious because I thought Planck was kind of a arbitrary number.
No, it is the musical key signature of every wave that physics has ever measured for the reason I just explained.
Okay, thank you. My mind's been blown. I'm kind of out of ideas. You've been such a pleasure. I appreciate you.
So Planck is literally on fire. That's why it's called PlanckFire.com. But I think on that note, actually, my voice is starting to go, Aaron. So maybe since we had so much fun, is this good?
Yeah. No, if this feels good to you, do you want to take one or two more questions? Do you want to call it good now? We have plenty.
Well, did anybody else have any pressing questions or they were excited about? Please.
Yeah, anybody on here, Seven, anybody on here haven't spoken yet, or anybody on stage has kind of some final thoughts here before Dan heads out?
I had a quick one if we could.
Yeah, go for it.
Yep.
I just wanted to throw to one thing for Nate to think about in his time travel, maybe Ashton for the wormholes, is you have to get away from the materialism. So if nothing is moving, consciousness doesn't move. Consciousness is a pathway, right? So then the movement, any kind of wormhole or hopping is more about the pathways than the material thing being transported or teleported from one thing to the next. And for me, Dan, this is maybe a little bit of personal therapy, so I appreciate the patience. But, I'm like a physics guy. I'm not a UFO guy. I'm not an alien guy. I was kind of old in my life and a little depressing to find out that all this physics is like PSYOP, BS, and all this. But you're very casual and you're very easy with the side that I'm kind of very uncomfortable is with this kind of alien stuff. So maybe you could, if you could end it there and maybe help bridge my own gap there a little bit.
About the ET history kind of thing. In terms of the wave not moving, if the billiard balls are all touching each other 1 billion down the row and one bounces off at the other end almost instantly, the billiard balls didn't move, but they conveyed something like the water wave. So we're the media.
I think it's all the phonons and the solitons, and to me, it's all inclusions in the quasi lattice, right? So they appear to move, right? But
yes, and if you and only if you nest that lattice by PlanckFire.com, Dodecke Cosa infinitely, does that array function like that with perfected distribution efficiently. Exactly. But and was your question about ET context, or what was your question there?
Well, you were mentioning like the Stargate off somewhere, and I like even listening to the flat earthers because I think they're trying to be scientific, and the Earth is so big it appears flat. So I understand their mode of questioning, right? Because in their everyday consciousness, it's hard to imagine the Earth is so big it's this round thing. So I have trouble even getting out to like any kind of ET, aliens, UFOs, and I have some other things I'm kind of bent on, which I guess keep me from going there. But you seem very casual or very connected to that kind of larger world of NHI stuff. So I was just curious if you had a thought there as we end it.
Well, I have been teaching the extraterrestrial history of the Earth for over 30 years, and I know almost everyone involved in the field. My library on that is fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And I think it is essential to have some sense of the Earth's extraterrestrial history, or you really just don't get it. But what we know about many of the very advanced ET races is they all understood this physics. And by the way, they say use base 12 mathematics, in which the golden ratio is not an imaginary number, by the way. So, but it's a long story. But I think some ET history is essential for getting the deep physics.
So I need to do some reading, is what you're saying. Thank you, though.
Well, this is real. They're out there and it should not be ignored.
Awesome. And Seven, did you have a question for Ian?
Hello. Hello, Mr. Dan. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks, Aaron, for giving me this opportunity to speak. Greetings and much love from the continent of Europe, Mr. Dan. I have a tremendous amount of respect for you and your work, sir. This being said, I don't want to take much of your time. I know you're tired. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on two concepts. First would be the concept of magnetohydrodynamics and maybe touch a bit on Schauberger's work. And second would be sentient orbs or plasma. And if you ever heard of a concept called triarchy of sentience, mentioned by Salvatore Pais in one of Ashton's Hard Truths podcasts. And shout out to Ashton too for his amazing work and dedication with this opportunity.
Well, thank you. Magnetohydrodynamics, I think, refers to the idea, which even Nassim got right, is that the universe is simply a media of a liquid, which is a superfluid named charge. And the compression rarefaction of that superfluid named charge it's a liquid, literally. So magneto is hydrodynamic. Voltage is pressure and amperage is flow. It's literally a liquid for sure. Magnetohydrodynamic. But then you asked about intelligent plasma. I think we studied some of why ball lightning, obviously toroidal, responds so well, so often to telepathy. We think we understand why. There's a longitudinal compressional implosion node at the center of superfluid ball lightning, which locks it into the array, and therefore that embedding in that array makes it non-destructive self-reentry, definition of self-awareness, and therefore responds so well to telepathy. Our friend George in Hungary did that work. So, the hydrodynamic model works, and it's obvious how plasma becomes self-aware. It implodes, as in the vortex inside your synapses. When it implodes, we call that consciousness. And you can take that donut with you when you dream and when you die. In fact, it's critical to learn how. But the triarchy, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar. I haven't looked at that, so I can't comment there.
Thank you very much for your answer, sir. Great honor. Much love.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a great questions to ask, and great engagement with you, Dan, as always. And Dan's also got, again, the first link in the slide up there is the firearray.com gain energy collapse link that takes you to the slides Dan was mentioning today. You've also got firearray.com where you can look at the device that Dan's talking about specifically. He's also starting again Fractal University here coming up in April. They'll be doing on Sundays with I believe is it a Zoom web link or something we'll be able to share with people here on X. Is that right, Dan?
Yes, fractalu.com relaunches Sunday, April 6th. Every Sunday, 2 p.m. New York time, conference, free conversation, fun stuff. Fractalu.com relaunching Sunday, April 6th, 2 p.m. New York time. Join us. It's free and fun. Thank you. And at firearray.com, in both links, you'll find the links to all our other technologies are at those links as well. So thank you. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Aaron. This is, again, I have to say, you guys are the most intelligent audience I ever meet. So, boy, am I grateful for this. But it's true, my voice is kind of dying now. So thank you and blessings.
Yeah, you too, Dan. Take care. We feel the same about you. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Blessings. Nice.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to work with all of you some more. It's really fun. Thank you. Blessings. Blessings.
Take care, Holmes.
Bye-bye.
Power. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Russ. Bye-bye, everybody.